Good morning. I'm glad that so many could be with us this morning. And I'm not personally a particularly time-conscious person, but I know that some Americans are. So you heard it from Dustin himself that I was bugging him to get started, so you can't blame the preacher if services go long. I wanted to make you aware of a couple things. First of all, we have potluck today after services across the way in the other building, so everyone is welcome to come and eat with us. Whether you brought food or not, please stay and have fellowship with us. We'd love for you to be able to do that. And after that, we have our own Ron Maynard, who's going to be doing a series of the Fishers of Men classes here to train us in personal evangelism. He's a man who has dedicated his life to evangelism and to teaching others how to be better at evangelism. And that's his profession and something that we could really benefit from taking part in that if you haven't done so or if you'd like to do so again. And if you're not sure about it or just want to see what it's like, feel free to come and just see what it's like this week. Everyone's welcome. You didn't have to sign up before today. Just come on and be a part of that. One more thing, just an idea that we've been working on. There's an opportunity this week to do some volunteer work to make some food for the volunteers who are building houses and doing things for Habitat for Humanity. So some of us young people are probably going to get together maybe Tuesday night, or if someone else has a night that would be good for them, any night this week would work, that we could get together, after work and make some meals for that opportunity that we have. So if you're interested, let me know. I'd like to talk this morning about idolatry and about having false gods. There are a couple senses in which we think about false gods and about idolatry. One is that classical idea of idolatry, which is bowing down and worshiping images that have been made with human hands. And that was a struggle for Israel for much of their existence as God's people. And then there's the idea of idolatry, or having false gods today, in the form of placing anything above God in our hearts, of making something else the chief object of our desire, or making something else that which determines our actions. So part one of that discussion is thinking about classical idolatry in the Bible, that traditional idea of idolatry. The word idol literally means something like an image. And so it's this idea of worshiping an image, something that isn't really God. And God warned Israel about this when he gave them the Ten Commandments, for instance, in Exodus 20, verses 3 and 4. He said, "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God." As if God was saying, as a people, I own you. I have authority over you. I will not share you with other gods. I will not share first place in your heart with other competitors. Something else that was special about the God of Israel is that he wasn't a God that had an image where we knew what he looked like. All the other gods that people had, they drew them and they said, well, this is what our God looks like. But God was different from all those other false gods that men had created, and that we didn't even know what he looked like. And he was omnipresent, all-knowing. He was just different from the other gods of the time. And he did not want them to have idols. He did not want to share his people with other gods. In Leviticus 19:4, he told them, "Do not turn to idols or make for yourselves any gods of cast metal. I am the Lord your God." And he warned them about the futility of following those false gods that they would encounter or that they would make for themselves, as they did when they made golden calves, for instance, while Moses was getting the Ten Commandments. In Jeremiah 11:12, we read, "The cities of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem will go and cry to the gods of whom they make offerings, but they cannot save them in their time of their trouble." And in Jonah 2:8, it was said, "Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. Not only was idolatry something that made God jealous, that he was not accepting of, but it's something that was just bad for his people. It did not serve them well to be worshiping gods that weren't gods, that could do nothing for them to help them, that could not give them righteous decrees or teach them how they really ought to live. Gods that are made in our own image are no better than us, and we don't have what we need without God to help us. And so there was a certain futility in it. It was damaging to their own lives. And not only in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament, we have commands about idolatry. In our time, we might not think very much about idolatry, but it's certainly there in the New Testament. 1 John chapter 5, verse 21 is a verse that we actually just looked at as we wrapped up our study of 1 John, in which we read, "Little children, keep yourselves from idols." And this was the last thing that John told them at the end of this letter that was very important to him. Keep yourselves from idols. And in 1 Corinthians 10:14, we read, "Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry." Idolatry is also listed in the New Testament in those famous lists of sins that you find from time to time. In Galatians 5, there's a list of sins, and in that list is idolatry, which is listed as a work of the flesh. And we are told those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. And likewise, in 1 Corinthians 6, we're told the same thing. Idolaters will not inherit the kingdom of God. In Revelation chapter 21, we read of idolatrous people. Their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. So idolatry was something that was on God's mind when he inspired men to write the New Testament. And it is important for us to know what idolatry is, how these verses do apply to us, how I would know if I was an idolater, because such strong language is used in regards to idolatry. There was a very clear instance in the New Testament in which Christianity was brought into conflict with idolatry. There's actually a couple instances. One of them is in Acts chapter 19, verses 23 through 27. So that might be a good place for us to go next as we still think about that classical idea of idolatry and how Christianity intersects with it. So this is when Paul and some other Christians were in Ephesus. And it says, "About that time there occurred no small disturbance concerning the way. For a man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines to Artemis, was bringing no little business to the craftsmen. These he gathered together with the workmen of similar trades and said, 'Men, you know that our prosperity depends upon this business. You see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a considerable number of people, saying that gods made with hands are no gods at all. Not only is there danger that this trade of ours will fall into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis be regarded as worthless, and that she whom all of Asia and the world worship will even be dethroned from her magnificence.'" So Artemis was the god of Ephesus, or goddess, I should say, in Ephesus. She was the twin sister of Apollo, the daughter of Zeus, and there were all these different gods that these people genuinely believed in and worshipped. And history has shown us that Demetrius was right to be worried about what Paul was teaching, because once Christianity really took hold in the hearts and minds of more and more people, the worship of goddesses like Apollo was done away with, and they don't really have any followers today. When he said that she whom all of Asia and the world will worship will even be dethroned from her magnificence, indeed that has been accomplished by the teachings of Paul and on behalf of Jesus. But there was a real conflict here, and it says, "When they heard this, they were filled with rage. They began crying out, saying, 'Great is Artemis of the Ephesians.' The city was filled with the confusion, and they rushed with one accord into the theater, dragging along Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia. And it says, a single outcry arose from them all, as they shouted for about 2 hours, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. And I believe you would find that any time when you take what is so important to someone, what someone worships, what has the highest place in their heart, or what brings them a lot of income, in the case of Demetrius, and you threaten to take it away, that people will become very upset. We do not like to have our idols taken away. I think you would find today that if Christianity threatens an idol of American culture, that people will become very upset, as these people became upset. I think you will find that if we have idols in our own hearts and they are threatened to be taken away, that we will feel a sense of alarm. And this, if you're interested, this is a modern-day reconstruction of the temple of Artemis in Ephesus that they would have gone to worship her. So that was part one, kind of a look at that classical idea of idolatry. Now let's think about the new false gods of the modern world. There is still, it is true, a problem in our world with people who worship, who bow down and worship and pray to objects that are made with hands. But there are also many new false gods, especially, for instance, in America, in the modern world, in the industrialized world. Things that we would put in the highest place in our lives. Everyone has to put something in the top spot. And you might think that idolatry isn't really a problem anymore. We don't even need to use the word idolatry to refer to those kinds of things. But for instance, in Colossians chapter 3, verse 5, we're told, "Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you, sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry." So it is a biblical concept that making something the object of our divine veneration, of making something the object of our deepest desires, as if we were worshiping it, is a form of idolatry. And I think in Romans 1, we really have a description of what idolatry is and how we could be a part of it. I know this text is kind of small. There's so much in Romans chapter 1 here. And I want you to notice how Paul is describing idolatry. He says, "Professing to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man and of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures." Isn't that what people do when they commit idolatries? They exchange the glory of the incorruptible God for something else. That's what Israel did when Moses was up on the mountain talking to the real God, and they exchanged that for some golden calves that they made with their own hands. It goes on in Romans 1 to say, "Therefore God gave them over in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them." And here's the word exchanged again. "For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen." So there are some more exchanges. The truth of God is that which would command obedience from us, would teach us how to live. And it's idolatry if we exchange God as the one who gives us that truth for some other means of deciding what the truth is. And it's idolatry if we exchange the object of our worship from the Creator to a creature. And a creature literally just means a created thing. So a creature is anything other than God. Everything has been created by God. So you've got two categories, God and creatures, the Creator and the creature. And idolatry is exchanging the creature and the Creator. So we could worship ourselves. We could idolize our spouses, our careers. We could idolize our hobbies. We could idolize anything that we exchange for God. He says, "For this reason God gave them over to degrading passions, for their women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural." So in their behaviors there was an exchange. And then he says, and just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind. So that really, I think, illustrates and develops the idea of idolatry as an exchange, as taking something other than God and making it our highest standard for right and wrong, making it that which we desire more than all else. And I want to suggest that the false gods of our time are us. Not literally us in this room, but just people. People don't tend to believe anymore in these gods up in the sky who tell them what to do, but they believe in themselves and their own desires and what they want, suggesting that the false god of our time is the individual, and the false religion of our time is individualism. And that kind of grew out of what is a very good thing, which is insisting on humans having those freedoms that God has given to them. And then we sort of continue to take that idea further and further until we say, I should have the freedom to do anything, even if it harms other people in some cases. So think about this idea with me. In the Old Testament, you had the idea of child sacrifice. They're warned in Leviticus 18:21, you shall not give any of your children to offer them to Molech, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. And in 2 Kings 23:10, we see some indication that Israel did that. Instead of a king that was cleaning up after that, he defiled Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, that no one might burn his son or his daughter as an offering to Molech. So how would that manifest itself when the gods are us and the religion is individualism? I would suggest that abortions is the modern day manifestation of that. The over 59 million babies have been aborted in the U.S. since 1973. Over 1.4 billion it is estimated worldwide since 1980, and over 100,000 each year in the U.S. And how can we possibly wrap our minds around 1.4 billion individuals not existing who would have, many of whom would have lived in Mankato, some of whom might have been sitting here with us this morning. But if you think about this from the perspective of idolatry, I hope it paints a clear picture to us that when the God is the individual, and that is the highest standard that a society has, is what do I want, then it becomes acceptable to have a child sacrifice to the needs of the individual. Another problem in the ancient world would have been cult prostitution, which is kind of an oxymoron, because literally what the original language says is sacred prostitution or holy prostitution. So you can see how far of an idea that is from what God would have truly wanted for his people. And they were warned in Deuteronomy 23:17, none of the daughters of Israel shall be a cult prostitute, nor shall any of the sons of Israel be a cult prostitute. But this verse in Hosea 4, in the context of Hosea, teaches us that happened in Israel as well. So they offer sacrifices on the tops of the mountains and burn incense on the hills under oak, poplar, and terebinth, because their shade is pleasant. Therefore your daughters play the harlot, and your brides commit adultery. And especially in the context of talking about those hills and those trees that they love to sit under, those were all the places where they would set up their worship to the foreign gods who had cult prostitutes as a part of their worship. So is there something like cult prostitution that you could associate with the religion of individualism and the idea that whatever any person wants is their own highest good? I'd say pornography would be the equivalent today. I shared this quote because this is a quote by a philosopher named David Bentley Hart, and he was talking about the COPA legislation, which was this legislation designed to prevent children from stumbling upon pornography or gaining access to pornography before they were 18, which was the law. That bill was passed in 1998, but then it was struck down repeatedly by courts and never took effect. Measures to keep children from viewing pornography never actually required by law. And the reason why was because it infringed upon the rights of the pornographers and their free speech. And his remark was, "It is difficult for me to grasp why the court works upon the premise that whatever means are employed to protect children from internet pornography should involve the barest minimum imposition possible upon the free expression of pornographers." But see, when this idea of my personal freedom to do what I want is carried to the extreme, then that becomes the highest good, and other things have to be sacrificed for that. The idea of individualism, even in the dictionary, was given here, is a doctrine that the interests of the individual are or ought to be ethically paramount. That is the most important consideration, and conduct guided by such a doctrine. Or the other definition given was the conception that all values, rights, and duties originate in individuals. So what is good for society and what is good for those around me takes a backseat to what I want. Can you imagine if Jesus had been a follower of individualism, that he thought that the interests of him as an individual were or ought to be ethically paramount, that his needs ought to be more important than anyone else's? We are so blessed by the fact that Jesus, while he did pray that that cup would pass for him, said, "Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." There is something higher than my will in the universe, and he did that for us. So you can think of what might be considered the demigods of individualism, lower gods underneath that ultimate God of me. And these are things like all things that you could idolize that have their proper place, but that can take the place of God if we let them. One is technology. I like the line from Jurassic Park where the guy says, "Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should." But if the ultimate good is that I get to do whatever I want, then technology is always good because it always gives me more power to do what I want. The idea of consumerism is having so many different options for us to pick which we want, which would increase our freedom and be a good thing. Materialism would be the capability to get more of what I want to satisfy myself. And libertinism, basically this idea that we should have no rules imposed upon us by anyone, to literally be able to do whatever we want, is the idea that restrictions on my free expression are inherently bad because what I want is the ultimate thing. My own desires are my gods. So, we could spend a long time talking about America or society today and talking about all the things that we see that are wrong with it, and all these manifestations of individualism and how everyone else is selfish. But the important question for us, to move to the third part, is, are Christians guilty? Have we made an idol out of our own desires or out of anything else in our lives? And might there be some subtle ways that that's happening in our lives that we need to think about? I don't think any of us have made a shrine to ourselves or bow down and physically worship something like our cars or something like that. But might we still be guilty of idolatry? I want to help us to think about that in the third and final part of our discussion of idolatry. I would suggest that a Christian is guilty of the idolatry of individualism if there are a couple things. One of them is if they let personal preferences hurt their brothers and sisters. That is to say, well, what I like to do and what I want to do is so important that it doesn't matter if it hurts you. My wants come first. In Romans 14, I believe this is a very important passage. Paul says, "Therefore, let us not judge one another anymore, but rather determine this, not to put an obstacle or a stumbling block in a brother's way. For if because of food your brother is hurt, you are no longer walking according to love. Do not destroy with food him for whom Christ died. Do not tear down the work of God for the sake of food. All things indeed are clean, but they are evil for the man who eats and gives offense. It is good not to eat meat or to drink wine or to do anything by which your brother stumbles." Then in 1 Corinthians 8:13, he said, "Therefore, if food causes my brother to stumble, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause my brother to stumble." I have some questions to think about in regards to this idea. You see Paul, and really in Romans 14, what he seems to be saying is, even if it were not wrong to eat meat sacrificed to idols, you still should not do it if it will harm someone else's faith. And here's some questions for self-examination. Does my personal comfort come before the spiritual well-being of my brothers and sisters? I don't take any public stance on any particular question of modesty, but I think it is against the spirit of this teaching from the Bible when someone makes an argument for wearing something that others have said is immodest by saying, well, it's what I want to do and I think it's comfortable, and if they have a problem with it, well, then that's their problem. That doesn't really go with the spirit of Romans 14 that says even if it is okay, even if there is nothing wrong with it, if it causes someone else to stumble in their faith, then it's a problem. So there could be different rationales for why people would wear different things. But personal comfort probably shouldn't be one of them. Next, how do I treat those who are more conservative than I am? It was a more conservative stance for people to say, well, we shouldn't eat this meat. And there may be times when people are more and more conservative than us. I've heard before about people coming to this church and saying that they wanted to only use one cup for communion, and that we were willing to do that, to accommodate them. And that's an admirable stance. You hear also of many instances where one church thinks that it's okay to use instrumental music and another does not. And then for the sake of them being able to come together, one will put away those instruments. I think that's another example where we can ask the question, how do I treat those who are more conservative than I am? Do I just say, well, they're just being a bunch of Pharisees and that's their problem? Or do we, like Romans 14, say, I'm willing to make sacrifices in order to accommodate someone else? And how often do I say things like, well, that's their problem? The second thing I want to draw our attention to, a Christian may be guilty of the idolatry of individualism if they refuse to take an interest in that which interests others. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 9:19-23, though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all so that I may win more. To the Jews I became a Jew, to those under the law, as without the law. To the weak I became weak, I have become all things to all men, so that I may by all means save some. Paul didn't have to become all different things to all different people, but he chose to do that. Even though it probably wasn't what he really wanted to do as an individual. As an example, in Acts 21, Paul pays the expenses for these other men to shave their heads to fulfill this Jewish vows that they've done. And he does that to show his fellow Jews that he's not against them and that he's not teaching that they can't observe any of their Jewish practices. He certainly taught that they weren't saved by keeping the Jewish law. But that was a time in which he did something, he took an interest in something that really was of more interest to others than to him. Likewise, in Acts 16, he had Timothy circumcised for similar reasons. You really have to be dedicated to taking an interest in the interests of others to do something like that voluntarily when you don't have to. I think Paul could have easily said, that's their problem if they don't like the fact that Timothy's not circumcised. But in that case, he didn't do that. So some more questions for self-examination. And I know some of these seem pretty silly, but they're an example of whether we take an interest in what interests others. Am I a good sport if we don't play the board game that I want to play? Am I a good sport when we don't go to the restaurant that I want to go to? Or am I willing to go to places or to do things or to learn about things that don't really interest me because they interest other people in my life? So I hope that gives us something to think about, to consider whether we might be guilty of some form of idolatry, and that we might take what's interesting to us or an opinion that we hold or a belief that we hold and to elevate it over the good of others. There's one final question I have for your self-examination. Am I willing to die with Christ, putting to death my old person of sin, and submit myself to the one true God of heaven? When Paul talks about baptism in Romans 6, he talks about it as a putting to death of the old person who we once were. And as much as we've been talking about making an idol out of our own desires and out of our own selves, the way to get rid of that idol is to kill it in the waters of baptism. So if you are willing to do that, and if you want to do that this morning, or if we can help you in any way, then you can come as we stand and sing together.
It's so sweet to trust in Jesus.